All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s, when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. This episode is brought to you by Progressive, home of the Name Your Price tool. You say how much you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll show you coverage options that fit your budget. It's easy to start a quote. Visit Progressive.com to get started. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, March 26, 1812, a political cartoon appeared in the Boston Gazette. The subject of the cartoon was a new voting district in Massachusetts that had been proposed by the party of Governor Elbridge Gerry. The district had a very weird shape, a sort of thick body and then this long, craning neck-type part, and the cartoonist took that shape and turned it into a caricature of a salamander. And he dubbed this description the gerrymander, Governor Gerry, a salamander, you get it. And that is how we got the name for what happens when politicians draw very convoluted shapes for districts, often to gain a political edge by including some voters or excluding some others. And of course, the shapes continue to this day. Gerrymandering is one of the, I would say, building blocks of our dysfunctional American democracy, a long and proud tradition going all the way back to 1812. So let's talk about it with, as always, Nicole Hammer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And our special guest for this episode back on the show is Harry Enten of CNN, host of the podcast Margins of Error, and my former compatriot on the 538 podcast. Harry, good to see you again, as always.
Shalom. Shalom to everybody. It's a misty day outside my window, but the warm feelings I have for all involved in this chat wipe those clouds and that fog away in no time.
Wow. What a scene. What a scene. A couple fact checks to the intro that I wrote. I'm going to fact check myself immediately. There is actually controversy about Gary or Gerry. It is gerrymander, has what it's been called, but apparently Gary is how he pronounced his last name. And then the other one, Harry, you and I were texting a little bit about this. Elbridge is a deeply weird early 19th century name.
Well, what is I must admit, it's one of those things where obviously, I know the story, at least the overtones of it, right? The outlines of it, but I always want to call him Eldridge. What is Elbridge? Sure. What is going on here? Yeah. I don't even know.
Yeah. I think that there's a lot of confusion packed into that name.
Yeah. And then the other thing that I like is that he was a member of the Jeffersonian Democratic Republican Party. So to tell you kind of how old this story is, it's when the two parties were just one party, and it was the Democratic Republican Party. But I guess on that point, Harry, people may know this history. Oh, it was like a salamander or whatever. But 1812, I mean, that is early, and I just have to remind myself, this feels like such a modern phenomenon. Obviously, we think of computers writing districts and da-da-da. I mean, it's just a real deep tradition.
It's a deep tradition, goes, as you're mentioning, goes all the way back to 1812. The opposition party was the Federalists. So basically, it's like we're going back to Founding Fathers times, right? This is still when James Madison was the president of the United States, and I think it just gives you an understanding that in our American politics, anything that seems new is actually very old, whether it be gerrymandering, whether it be political polarization. All of these things tend to have roots in the 19th century, even if they've reappeared and perhaps are worse in the 21st century.
And I think it speaks to something about the nature of two-party governance, right? Because the two parties are just emerging at this moment. And nearly as soon as you have a two-party system, you have these battles to gain superiority by how you draw the maps.
Yeah, I think that's something to me that sort of boggled my mind, is that, like, even when you think about maps and how maps are like written up in 1812, it's not completely different from how we think of it today, but the fact that the agenda was always like political power, control, or economic control to some extent has always been at the origins of this.
I just to quickly jump on and sort of perhaps tie a bow in some sense, we see a lot of times in the early days of our republic, these assumptions that the founding fathers had sort of completely fall apart, right? Where we had to change the way we elected our vice presidents. The idea that there wouldn't be political parties. In fact, there were. It comes to the drawing of the lines, that there would be real, politics involved with that, draw to one party's advantage. A lot of these assumptions kind of fall by the wayside as the governing actually has to take place.
Yeah.
Are you suggesting that the Constitution is a living document, Harry?
I you know what, that is quite the can of worms, and I prefer
CNN contributor
soda.
Harry Enten takes stance on original. But to this point, I mean, so first off, it's important, Gerry, let's call him Gerry. Man, Gerry, I don't know. He had, as we were sort of saying, he had called for an end to partisan warfare and sort of said the parties should come together. And then, of course, push comes to shove, a lot of it based around the war with Great Britain starting in 1811, and the Federalists sort of taking out a different stance. All of a sudden, he starts to see it as a bit of a zero-sum game. But to Niki's point, I mean, I'm trying to get a sense of, like, what is the motivating factor at the root of gerrymandering? Obviously, there's something about power, but it's also something about how we vote, how it is seen as a zero-sum game. And so I'm just curious, Harry, like, kind of what are the building blocks that lead to these absurd districts?
You mentioned power, but I think at the end of the day, what it really comes down to, whether it be, in 1812 or whether it be today, is that when you're out of power, you oftentimes talk about process. You have complaints about process. We see this across the political board. He shouldn't be doing it that way. Complaints about process are, in my mind, almost always complete BS. They're complete BS, and I think that this kind of gets at that, right? He gets into power. They go into 1812. They realize they're worried they're going to lose the state legislature, so we're going to redraw some of these lines. Perhaps we're not, we're going to do them in a weird way that kind of looks like a salamander or whatever the heck you want to say it looks like. And process complaints fall by the wayside, and what really people want is, yes, it's about keeping their party in power, but it's also about winning. I mean, winning is the ultimate thing in politics, because you can't do anything if you're not winning. And that's the ultimate goal of elections, because if you're out of power and you're not winning, then all the good ideas you may have, they fall by the wayside because you can't actually implement them.
And that's where, like, principles and power get muddled together, right? Gerry saw himself as defending a set of principles, and he believed that he had to gerrymander these districts and draw them in this way in order to keep his party in power and make sure that those principles and those ideas prevailed. So he didn't necessarily see a conflict between his principles and his desire for power. He saw them working in tandem.
I see myself as a muscular man when I look in the mirror, but in fact I have a dad bod, so there are a lot of things we think about.
But that we have been telling ourselves these same things for 200 years, I think, is the broader point.
But it's also that these debates are so cyclical. So every time there's an election, every time there's a new census, every time there is a surge or a decline, we come back to this debate all over again. It's sort of the same thing with the Electoral College as well. It's like all these things are fine until someone that you like is in power or don't like is in power. And then we have these debates all over again about how do we restructure a system that puts those who we don't want in power out of power. But then I feel like we're so forgetful of, once that goal has been achieved, then it's okay, business as usual until the next moment that it's required to rethink these ideas. Sort of like daylight savings time, you know.
Front of mind twice a year.
Yes.
When you say daylight saving time, of course, my eyes light up and my ears open up, because that is one of my favorite topics. And it's exactly right. I mean, it's kind of, 48 and a half years ago or so, when we had this topic about, we should go to daylight saving time full year round. We tried it. It stunk it up. We decided to take it back. And this is kind of a similar thing, right? Whereby we have these debates every 10 years. We seem to forget about them. Oh, we're going to do something a little bit better. But at the end of the day, maybe we've moved towards some nonpartisan commissions. But, parties want the power so they can do what they want to do.
Mm-hmm. Daylight savings, of course.
Saving. It's saving. It's one. It's not
right,
plural.
I know. Daylight saving. Sorry. Daylight saving, of course, being the only thing, apparently, that our very gerrymandered political bodies can actually agree on and pass something unanimously, which they've done now. So we'll see. But, I'm curious about alternatives here, because I think we can look at these maps and say, this is absurd on its face. Something about this looks weird, and even going all the way back to 1812, it is a really absurd shape. Go look it up, folks. But prior to this, the districts were just followed county lines. County lines are arbitrary too, and so at some level you're just deciding where the lines are going to be. And Harry, I'm just curious, maybe it's a chance to talk about some alternative ideas or some things that feel more fair, which obviously have pitfalls, but at some point you're just drawing lines, and some voters are on one side of it and some voters are on the other.
That's 100% true. I mean, county lines oftentimes perhaps follow rivers. They can follow old disputes. Look, we did a project where Jody and I used to be employed, 538, I think it was the redistricting project. And we essentially, did, okay, should the districts be compact? Should they basically, follow county lines? Should they make it so that they maximize proportionality to the statewide vote? Where if it's 50% statewide, Democrat, Republican, it should be 5 and 5 if you have 10 seats. Should it be the case that you try and maximize minority or people of color in terms of their representation in your given electoral body? There are a lot of different ways that this can sort of be done. And I will be honest, I do think to some degree, even if we're having fun here with Gerry or gerrymandering, I think it gets to some sort of bad rap. I do think, though, that there are some times where you look at a line and you go, really?
Yeah.
That's what you came up with? That seems like the only reason you would have come up with that was because you're trying to maximize partisan advantage. And maybe that's an okay thing, but we should at least acknowledge it.
There's something also about this that I think is highly racialized that we don't often talk about. So in my class, we talk a lot about mass incarceration. And in Wisconsin, I'm forgetting the name of the town, but the town is like extremely small. It's like maybe 400, 500 people in the town. But there is a prison there that has like 5,000 inmates within that facility. And so the way the districting is done is that elected official represents like 5,500 people, but only 500 of those people can actually vote. So the representation there is completely skewed because most of the people who are incarcerated don't have the privilege of being able to vote.
There's a lot of upstate New York districts that are sort of the same way, right?
Yeah. That's right. And that's one of the great debates we often have. It's multiple debates that we have in there, right? You mentioned, the prison debate, whether or not, what should we be redistricting around, right? Should it be people who can vote? Should it be citizens? Should it be all adults? Then you get into whole things, whether or not prisoners should vote. There's also, in the southern United States, we often have these arguments, should we maximize the number of people of color districts, right, where they can elect a person of their choosing? These are debates that continue on. And so there's a lot of cross currents with what's going on in our political culture at large that Gerry or gerrymandering kind of run through.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that there is something, and it's there in the name, right? Gerrymandering, that it is reflecting that the shape of the district was so odd, it made it into the name. And this, I think, gets to your point, Jody, about making it county lines instead of these weird sort of shapes. There's something about the shapes themselves, that the odder they get, the more people visually feel like they're being manipulated. And that comes all the way through today. You can buy these little necklaces that are in the shape of your district. And the point is, like, look how weirdly my district is shaped because of gerrymandering. And so the power of that visual is really interesting.
I would just add, in terms of that, perhaps gerrymandering isn't that bad or weird shapes aren't that bad. Sometimes communities of interest kind of fall along weird lines that aren't in square boxes, right? I think of Chicago, right? And there's, essentially the earmuffs district, right? Where Hispanic voters kind of form this earmuff in Chicago. And you look at that, you say, that's a weird looking district, but it in fact makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So, I mean, pour a little one out for weird shaped districts. They're not always that bad.
Yeah. And it is also very fun. I mean, the Washington Post is really good about this. They sort of, especially because Maryland is one of the sort of most absurdly gerrymandered states out there. So they always have a lot of fun with the names of the various districts. There was like Abe Lincoln riding a lawnmower was one district and so forth. Yeah. I mean, look, I just want to say, like, I'm turned off by this sort of severe gerrymandering, and I think, like, at some level there's a trust your gut, and if something looks really fishy, then there's a chance that it is, and I think that's often the case. But I also want to acknowledge, as we've been saying, all of the pitfalls of other alternatives and all the other sort of factors here. In addition, maybe we can get to this in a minute, but, like, to the fact that to some extent, as a product or a symptom of all this, but, we are sort of gerrymandering ourselves at this point, and a lot of this might be moot because we're so segregated. But going back to 1812, I just want to, get to a couple things here. I mean, one, so the story is, I think, older than a lot of people realize. The other, though, Harry, I'm curious if you just know anything about, like, the political data that's available at that point, because we think of gerrymandering as such a precise, data-driven thing where I'm going to reach into this neighborhood in Baltimore because I know that there's, like, 1,000 black voters there, and I'm going to link them to this with this small little quarter. This is an incredibly precise district drawn in 1812. Like, what level of sort of political data or mapping sophistication was there to even allow them to dream this thing up?
Well, obviously they had Steve Jobs' great-great-great-great-grandfather, and they had, the first apples there. No, I mean, look, this type of political data, especially in New England, often, which as a region tends to break down things on a much lower level than, other places where you can get town data very easily there, it tends to be stuff that you can actually get. And there's I don't know how much y'all follow sort of the mapping community on Twitter. One of the fun things is they basically try and draw these, these old-timey maps whereby you're like, oh, yeah, I was really interested in the breakdown of the 1956 election in TK State by congressional district. That was what I was really looking for. But they do it. This data oftentimes is available. You just have to be able to do it. I think the real thing to me, it is wild. To me, the thing that's interesting is that you're trying to figure out, the level of polarization. Will this, work? Can we necessarily use this? But apparently, it did work. It did work, which is amazing.
Yeah. No, I mean, it often works. And in this case, it did work. It did flip this district, or it did make this district more favorable to that party. But it also, talk about just sort of these cycles having always been there, it also led to passage of a new districting law. And so, I think this is part of the story here, too, is just there's always been these attempts to then pass laws to undo this, and then working on ways to skirt those laws and find, loopholes and so forth, and so evermore. One of the little tidbit we're throwing in is that the word gerrymander existed back then, clearly. It didn't enter Webster's dictionary until 1864, 50-some years later. One theory is that it was because Noah Webster's family was friendly with the Gerry family, and this was a sort of not great legacy, and so they sort of slow-footed putting this into the lexicon. But yeah.
Well, we should say that Elbridge Gerry, he did some big things. He signed the Declaration of Independence. He refused
everyone
to
signed the
ratify
Declaration of Independence back then.
Fair.
We would have signed
My mom did.
He's not special.
No, sorry, Niki, carry on, please. It is true.
I was just going to say that he refused to sign the Constitution because he cared about the Bill of Rights and it wasn't included. And so he had this meaningful legacy, but of course the only thing we know him for is this. So a reminder to keep that legacy watch on at all times. Because one little thing could get you into the dictionary 50 years later.
One little political cartoon, yeah.
I know.
All right. So as we wrap up, I'm just curious from all of you, kind of, I feel like there's more conversations about this kind of stuff, both gerrymandering, redistricting, but just all the kind of like gears of democracy kind of stuff. I feel like there's a lot more talk about it now and a lot more awareness of it now than maybe there were in previous generations. Maybe I'm wrong here. But I'm just curious, Harry, how much you feel like this is in the bloodstream. People are comfortable with this for better or for worse. People are sort of talking about it, have opinions about it.
I mean, look, interest in politics right now is extremely high. You can see that in the turnout data. So it shouldn't be surprising that the mechanisms by which we elect people are extremely high as well. The other thing I will point out that unlike, say, 40 or 50 years ago, polarization is also extremely high. So the idea that you can better predict how different districts are going to vote based upon how perhaps they vote in the presidential election, and maybe it's not so candidate specific. So I think that's also playing a role. And the other thing I'll note is, look, from 1954, the 1954 elections through the 1994 elections, the Republicans did not win a single one of those. They did not have control of the House in a single one of those elections. So there really wasn't much of a thing where you go back and forth, and that the lines seem to matter as much then as they do now. And we basically now have House elections whereby they seem to go back every few years. So there's just more competition. So I think it's more in the bloodstream that way as well.
The voter participation in the end of the 19th century was very high, and that was also followed by a series of reforms, everything from the secret ballot to suffrage for women, mostly white women, to things like referendum initiative, direct election of senators. So there might be a connection between high participation in elections and attention to how elections are carried out.
Yeah. It matters whether there's voter suppression or voter participation. How easily people are able to access a ballot, I think, makes a lot of sense.
I would just add that it's so funny how on all these different levels, the late 19th century politics seem to be repeating themselves today. I mentioned polarization. That is, another thing that just kind of connects. Close elections, very close elections, same thing we have now. Those were when there were two of the splits between the popular vote winner and the electoral college vote winner. Same thing we see right now in 2000 and then 2016. So history has a way of repeating itself.
Yeah,
sure does.
and a sort of appetite for reform. And I think we're seeing that, whether it will actually go through or not. I definitely think that conversation is out there. And there's a lot more, I would say, sunlight on the 2020 redistricting cycle than the 2010 redistricting cycle, for sure. And, I think some attempts at extreme gerrymandering have been rebuffed or at least been sort of called out. Sorry, I did mention earlier, and Harry, I'm curious if you have a final thought on just like this idea that, we really are gerrymandering ourselves, putting ourselves into living in these deep blue, deep red places. I'm sure you have the stats on the sort of number of districts that are genuinely mixed at this point. It's getting smaller. And then the big question on top of that is like, is that symptom of gerrymandering? Did gerrymandering lead us to live together, or is it a parallel phenomenon, or is it a root problem? How does it fit into the equation?
I mean, what I would essentially say is, I don't think people are going, we're going to be gerrymandered anyway, so therefore, I am going to live in TK district. I mean, that's not what's cooking. But what I will note is one way that I always like to sort of do this is to say, okay, how many districts were competitive before redistricting versus after? And we know that the number of districts that were competitive before this redistricting versus this redistricting have gone down. But here's a stat that I kind of just keep in mind, and obviously this redistricting cycle continues on, but the number of districts that were within 10 points of the national vote in the previous presidential cycle, right? In 1982, it was 40%. In 1992, it was 34%. In 2002, it was 26%. In 2012, it was 24%. And right now, we're looking at this particular point, less than 20%, somewhere in the high teens. So there is no doubt that there are fewer people who are in competitive districts. And we know that the percentage of people who are in competitive districts, just even looking in between redistricting cycles, have gone down. So it's not just gerrymandering. Yes, that plays some role, we see fewer competitive districts now than we did, say, 2 years ago. So essentially, under the new lines, the number of districts that were, let's say, won by Biden by 10 points or more. This was a little bit earlier on in the redistricting cycle. There was already a net gain of 7 that Biden had won by 10 points or more. Trump won by 10 points or more. There was a net gain of 12 there. And there was some shrinking of the number of competitive districts under the old lines versus the new lines. But still, it is part of a long-term cycle.
Yeah. All right. Pop quiz, final question. In 2010, there was a extremely gerrymandered district that the Washington Post ran a contest to name. The winning name for it was Goofy Kicking Donald Duck, which is very accurate. It looks like a picture of Goofy kicking Donald Duck. Harry, do you know what district that was that got that name?
I have.
Can you name the state? What state had extreme redistricting in 2010?
Would be Maryland because of...
no, it's Pennsylvania.
Oh, it's Pennsylvania.
And it was the Pennsylvania 7th.
Pennsylvania 7th. So the freaking problem is that they redid the lines, right. And that, so they redid because the gerrymandering was so bad, they redid the lines, of course, for the 2018 election. I'm trying to remember what is my numbered district to kind of match up with the thing.
They changed the lines and they changed the district number.
I associate the 7th being in the southeast.
It's like west of Philadelphia, but then it like snakes up towards Pottstown and South.
Oh, that was Patrick Meehan's district, I want to say.
There you go. I knew you'd get this quiz at some point. Okay.
Meanwhile, I'm like so confused.
You and our listeners, more importantly. Okay. Let's end the episode there. Harry Enten, thank you so much. This is always fun to chat on a podcast with you. And Harry has his own podcast, Margins of Error. It's really wonderful. So go check it out, listeners. But thank you for doing this.
My pleasure. Any time to hear your dulcet tones is a time for me to be part of a podcast.
Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thanks, Jody.
Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is an all-in-one management software with apps for every business need. Odoo has apps for CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, manufacturing, and everything in between. And they're all in one easy-to-use software. And the best part about Odoo? All Odoo apps are integrated, helping you get things done faster and more efficiently. So, when you think about business, think Odoo. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday.
Radiotopia.